The words hit me harder than any fist ever could. Sign it over, or we go to court. Your choice. My son-in-law was standing in my own kitchen, the kitchen I had built with my own hands in 1987, the one where my wife Irene had made butter tarts every Christmas until the year she passed, and he was sliding a legal document across my counter like it was nothing. Like it was a grocery receipt. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him. Then I looked at my daughter, Cynthia, standing 2 steps behind him, arms crossed, eyes on the floor. She didn't look up once. I picked up the paper. I read it slowly. Then I set it back down and said, "I'll need some time." He smiled. That was the smile that would stay with me for months. His name was Reed. Reed Calloway. He'd come into my daughter's life about 5 years back when Cynthia was working as a project coordinator at a construction firm in Edmonton. He was charming in that particular way that only becomes obvious in hindsight, all handshakes and eye contact and remembering the names of your grandchildren. By the time I started to see the edges of who he actually was, they were already married, and my daughter already looked at me with that slightly defensive set to her jaw whenever I said anything even mildly skeptical about him. Cynthia is my only child. After her mother died, she was the only family I had left. I need you to understand that before you understand anything else about this story. My name is Gerald. I'm 68 years old. I retired 3 years ago from 32 years as a civil engineer with the city of Edmonton. I lived at that point in the house on the acreage I bought in 1984, out near Leduc County. 5 acres, a workshop, a garden Irene had planted that I kept alive mostly out of stubbornness. I'm not a wealthy man, but I've been careful my whole life. The property was worth a significant amount by then. Reed knew exactly what it was worth. He'd looked it up. I found that out later. The trouble started quietly, the way it always does. When Reed and Cynthia moved in, temporarily, they said, just until they found their footing after Reed's business restructured. I told myself it was fine. He was my son-in-law. She was my daughter. The house was too big for one old man. That's what I told myself. Within 3 months, Reed had rearranged the workshop. Without asking, he said he needed space to get some projects going. I let it pass. 6 months in, he started having his business associates over without telling me beforehand. Twice I came home to strangers sitting in my living room. I mentioned carefully that it would be nice to know ahead of time. Reed laughed and clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Come on, Gerald. This is a home, not a hotel. Relax." Cynthia was standing right there. She didn't say a word. By month 9, he was forwarding my mail to a P.O. box he'd set up, saying he was organizing things for me. He'd told Canada Post there was a new mailing address for my property. I only found out when my bank statement didn't come, and I called to ask. That was when I started writing things down. I kept a notebook in my truck. Every date, every incident, every name. It was a small blue notebook I'd bought at a Shoppers Drug Mart in Leduc. I don't know why I started doing it. Some instinct, maybe. The kind that comes from being an engineer for 3 decades. The part of your brain that says, document everything, because feelings are not evidence. The dinner conversation I remember most clearly happened in January. It was cold outside, the real Alberta cold that makes your porch creak at 2 in the morning, and we were eating the shepherd's pie I'd made from scratch. Reed put down his fork and said very casually, "Have you thought any more about the property trust idea?" He'd floated it once before in November. The idea was that I would transfer the acreage into a family trust, managed primarily by Reed for estate planning purposes. He'd brought a pamphlet from a financial planning office in Sherwood Park. The pamphlet looked real. I later found out the office had closed 2 years prior. I said I hadn't made any decisions. He looked at Cynthia. She looked at her plate. He said, "The thing is, Gerald, if something happens to you without proper planning, the estate could get tied up for years. We're just trying to protect the family." I said, "I appreciate that. I'd like to talk to my own lawyer first." He nodded slowly, the way you nod when someone says something you consider deeply naive. That was January. By March, the requests had a new edge to them. He started mentioning, offhand, always offhand, never directly, that he had contacts who were developing land along the highway corridor south of Edmonton, that properties like mine were being consolidated for commercial rezoning, that he could get me a good deal if I moved quickly, but that these things had narrow windows. The implication was always the same: do this now with me or lose the opportunity. I listened. I said very little. I kept writing in my notebook. What I didn't tell Reed or Cynthia was that I had an appointment with my lawyer Dennis, a man I'd known for 20 years, who did estates and property law out of a small office in Leduc, about a week after that March conversation. I'd been thinking about my will for some time. Irene's passing had clarified things, the way grief sometimes does. You stop assuming there's always more time. Dennis and I talked for a long time that day. I told him everything: the trust proposal, the mail redirection, the business associates in my living room, the document Reed had started preparing without anyone asking him to. Dennis listened the way a good lawyer listens, without expression, taking notes. When I was done, he said, "Gerald, what do you want the outcome to be?" I thought about that. Then I said, "I want my daughter to be okay, and I want my house." He said, "All right, let's make sure of both." Over the next 2 months, Dennis and I quietly reorganized my estate. The acreage went into a trust, yes, but one structured correctly, with proper legal documentation, administered by Dennis's firm and a trustee I chose myself, a retired accountant named Beverly, who'd been a family friend since Irene's hospital fundraising days. The trust was airtight. Reed couldn't touch it. More importantly, it was set up so that Cynthia would inherit a secure interest in the property, but only as a personal beneficiary, not through any joint structure with a spouse. I didn't tell anyone I'd done this. I kept going home. I kept making shepherd's pie. I kept letting Reed have his meetings in my living room. I watched. I wrote things down. The night Reed put that document in front of me, the one asking me to sign over the property into his name under the guise of some numbered company he'd registered in Alberta, I had already been sitting on that trust paperwork for 6 weeks. I read the document again, quietly, standing in my own kitchen. Then I said, "I'll need a few days." He said, "We've been waiting long enough, Gerald. I think you know the right thing to do here." I looked at Cynthia. She was still looking at the floor. She had my mother's hands, I thought, absently. Long fingers, square nails. Irene always said so. I said, "Give me until Saturday." He gave a short, impatient exhale, but he said fine. I spent Thursday on the phone. I called Dennis. I called Beverly. I called my neighbor Owen, who has a quarter section to the east of my property and who has, over 30 years, become the kind of friend you don't need to explain things to at length. He understands the whole picture from 3 sentences. I called my nephew in Saskatoon, who is a retired RCMP officer and who I trust completely. And I made a phone call to a woman named Patricia, who was the branch manager at the bank where I'd kept my accounts for 30 years. Patricia had seen some things go sideways with elder financial abuse cases in her career. She was also, I'll note, a person who believed that the law existed for a reason, and that paperwork done properly had a kind of quiet power that people like Reed consistently underestimated. On Saturday morning, I got up early and made breakfast. Real breakfast. Back bacon, eggs, toast from the sourdough I'd been keeping since Irene taught me to maintain the starter in 2009. I set the table properly. I used the good coffee. Reed came down first, butting his cuff, already looking like a man who expected to get what he wanted. I said, "Sit down. I made breakfast." He sat. He looked at the table and at me and said, "So, have you thought it over?" I said, "I have." I slid a folder across the table to him. He opened it with the confidence of someone who expects good news. It took him about 45 seconds to understand what he was reading. The trust documents, the existing estate plan, a letter from Dennis, on firm letterhead outlining the legal structure of the property and confirming that the acreage had been held in trust for 8 weeks. A second letter, also on firm letterhead, noting that any attempt to obtain property through undue influence, coercion, or fraudulent documentation was a matter Dennis had already flagged with the appropriate parties. At the bottom of the folder was a copy of the Canada Post redirection reversal I'd filed, and a printout from Service Alberta showing the registered owner of the numbered company Reed had put on that originator document. It was registered to a holding company. That holding company had another director. That director was an address in Calgary I did not recognize. I said, "I spoke to Dennis." Reed said nothing. The color had left his face in a particular way. I said, "I also spoke to Patricia at the bank, and to a retired officer I know who's familiar with how these complaints get filed." Cynthia had come downstairs by then. She was standing in the kitchen doorway in her housecoat, holding her mug, reading her father's face. I said, and I want to be clear that I said this very quietly, without anger, because I had not felt anger in some time. What I felt was something more like a deep and settled certainty. I said, "Cynthia, I love you. I will always love you. The trust is structured so you are protected. You will have your inheritance. Your name is in the documents, and it is safe." She didn't say anything. I looked at Reed. I said, "The property is not available. It will not become available. Whatever you were hoping to accomplish here is finished." He closed the folder. He pushed it back toward me, slowly, the way you push something away when you want to look like you're the one choosing to disengage. He said, "You'll regret this." I said, "I've regretted things in my life. Leaving my wife's hospital bedside to sleep for one night and missing her last hour. Selling a truck I loved in 1998 because I thought I needed the money. Not calling my father more in his last years." I paused. "This won't be on that list." He left the table. He went upstairs. I could hear him, the particular sound of a man who is angry and trying not to show how badly something has gone wrong for him. I ate my breakfast. What happened over the following weeks was not dramatic in the way these stories sometimes are. There was no single explosion. Reed moved out within the month, a decision that appeared to be his, though I think the legal letters had clarified the landscape for him considerably. He and Cynthia did not separate immediately. That took another 4 months, and it was painful for her in ways I couldn't fix, only sit beside. But I want to tell you about the evening that mattered most to me, because it wasn't the Saturday morning with the folder. It was quieter than that. It was a Tuesday in June, about 3 months after Reed moved out. Cynthia had been staying with a friend in St. Mate, Albert, and then, gradually, she'd started coming back out to Leduc on weekends. First just for Sunday dinner. Then sometimes Saturday too. We didn't talk about Reed much. We talked about other things. About her work, about a podcast she'd started listening to, about the garden, which I'd finally let go a little ragged in the front bed, and which she quietly started weeding one afternoon without being asked. That Tuesday she called and said she was coming for dinner, and could she stay the night. I made a roast. Nothing fancy, just the chuck roast in the slow cooker that Irene's mother had made every winter, the one where you put in a packet of Lipton onion soup mix and a can of cream of mushroom, and just leave it alone all day. The whole house smelled like 30 years of Sunday dinners by the time Cynthia pulled into the driveway. We ate, we talked. After dinner, we sat on the back step the way we used to when she was a teenager and I was working in the yard, and she'd come out and sit there with whatever book she was reading and just be nearby. She said I didn't know how far it had gone. With the mail. All of it. I said, I know. She said, I should have seen it. I said, you were inside it. That's different from seeing it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, were you scared? I thought about that honestly. I said, yes, not of him, of losing you. She put her head on my shoulder, the way she used to when she was maybe 7 years old and we'd watch Hockey Night in Canada together on the couch, back when the Oilers were still something to watch. I didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else that needed saying. Owen came by the next afternoon with a flat of tomato seedlings from his greenhouse. He set them on the back step and said, heard things sorted out. I said, getting there. He said, good. Then he got back in his truck and drove home. The trust stands. The acreage is still mine. And it will be Cynthia's in time, and it will be hers alone. Dennis filed what needed to be filed. Patricia's team flagged the account activity that needed flagging. The numbered company Reed had used appears to have been quietly dissolved. My nephew made a few calls. I didn't ask too many questions about. I still keep the blue notebook. Not because I need it now, but because it reminds me of something I already knew and somehow needed to relearn. Patience is not the same as weakness. Silence is not the same as consent. And the most important documents in a man's life are rarely the ones someone else is trying to get him to sign. Irene's starter is still alive in the refrigerator. I made sourdough last Sunday. Cynthia came over and took half the loaf home with her. That felt like enough. I think about the blue notebook sometimes. Such an ordinary thing. A $3 spiral notebook from Shoppers Drug Mart, sitting in the cup holder of my truck for months. No one knew it was there. Reed certainly didn't, and yet that notebook, more than anything else, is what protected me. Not anger, not confrontation. Just a quiet, stubborn commitment to writing down the truth as it happened, date by date, detail by detail. What I've come to understand is that the way things end is almost always a direct consequence of the way things were conducted along the way. Reed's approach was built on shortcuts, a pamphlet from an office that no longer existed, a numbered company registered to a name I didn't recognize, a document slid across a counter like it was routine. That kind of approach carries its own undoing inside it. It relies on the other person not paying attention, not asking questions, not keeping records. The moment I started doing all three, his entire strategy began to quietly collapse, even though neither of us knew it at the time. I wasn't smarter than Reed in any dramatic sense. I was just more careful. I'd spent 32 years as an engineer making sure that every calculation was checked, that every document was filed, that nothing was left to assumption. I applied the same discipline to my own life when it mattered most. That's not a special talent. It's just a choice, to take seriously the things that deserve to be taken seriously. And there's something I want to say about what it cost me to stay quiet during those months. Because it did cost something. There were evenings sitting at that dinner table when Reed would smile across at me and I would know exactly what he was doing, and I would say nothing. I would pass the bread. I would ask about his week. People sometimes think that patience is passive, that you're just waiting, just absorbing. But the patience I had to practice in those months was active. It required me to keep my judgment clear and my emotions from running ahead of the facts. That's harder than it sounds when someone is trying to take your home and your daughter is standing in the doorway, not looking at you. The part that mattered most to me in the end wasn't the folder on the table. It was the Tuesday in June, the roast in the slow cooker, Cynthia putting her head on my shoulder on the back step. That was the thing I'd been protecting all along. Not the acreage, not the property value, but the possibility of that evening. The chance that my daughter and I would still have a relationship on the other side of all of it. I think people who've been through something like this often feel ashamed that they didn't act sooner, or more forcefully, or differently. I've let that go. The choices I made were made with the information I had and the values I wanted to keep. I didn't want to become someone who operates through intimidation or retaliation. I wanted to be the kind of man who handled hard things with a clear head and a clean conscience so that when it was over, I could still recognize myself. Irene's sourdough starter is still going. It has been fed and maintained and kept alive through neglect and cold and more than one close call. I think about that sometimes as a kind of quiet instruction about what endures. Not everything that survives is loud about surviving.